If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 101, Heavy Topic. Not like a wall between my home and the outside world, because that would just trap us in while keeping everyone else out, but a sort of malicious intent-based screen to keep out anyone or anything with ill intent. Ironically, this was, as far as I understand it, one of the most basic of barriers in the world of JJK. Most barriers were just more or less exclusion zones that stopped normal people from seeing into or entering them, while preventing anything with cursed energy from leaving it without permission. My idea was pretty much the same, but with the first bit about normal people being changed to make the barrier non-existent for anyone or thing without malicious intent towards us. As much as I would like to make a badass barrier that could stand as a marvel for all time, I was like 90% sure I sucked at barriers. This was because of the nature of my innate technique that was an internal to external type deal. I transform things from the inside out by extending my cursed energy from my core to whatever I am working on. Barriers, on the other hand, were purely external things, which meant my technique gave me no experience at all in how I might go about creating them without using an item. Still, I needed to figure out how to use barriers anyways, since it was a requirement to use domain expansion. The penultimate expression of one's technique, where its very essence is projected into reality. While it is possible to create a domain without a barrier, it comes with a serious disadvantage for the sheer area it covered. You have to contend with the world itself. It can be considered an almost divine act, as when a domain is expanded outwards, that small area temporarily gains a new law of reality. That's what utilizing a domain means. When contained in a barrier, the strain it puts on the user, while great, is much lesser than without a barrier. Expanding a domain without a barrier is an act akin to a god utilizing their power to alter the very fabric of existence to a small degree, like using a paintbrush to draw in the very air. I was not ready for that sort of technique, and likely wouldn't be for quite some time. Honestly speaking, I wasn't even at the level where I could use a normal domain expansion quite yet, as I hadn't felt my technique reach such a level of refinement. Getting ahead of myself here, there's no telling if I'll even be able to siphon the cursed energy above the city before I level up. I thought, shaking my head to clear the distracting thoughts I was having. You didn't? Hestia exclaimed when I got back and unloaded my bags. About that, I may have neglected to mention that I was going to solo the Goliath. To be fair, I thought you'd try to stop me. I said, not even bothering to try and hide my actions. Of course I'd try to stop you. That's a level 4 monster Rex and you are a level 2. She yelled, very upset at me. I winced at her tone. I won though, and not a scratch on me. Admittedly, I also kinda cheated to do it, but still. I defended my actions. And what if? She started to yell, but I stopped her. Nope, none of that what if nonsense. You should only worry about what ifs in regards to the future, not the past. All that matters in this exact moment is that I fought the Goliath and won without injury. That's it. Yes, it was almost definitely kinda mean of me not to mention it, but I needed to do this to level up. It's not fair to you. You have the best intentions, but we are adventurers, and that means we need to take risks in order to grow. We can't grow if you try to keep us from taking those risks every time you learn about them. I said seriously. She floundered for a moment as she got mad, reluctant, and finally accepted that I was right. Can you blame me for worrying? You might not be all there up top, but even you have to understand how ridiculous a level 2, even you, challenging the Goliath solo is. And it's not just this one time either, but Belle is a magnet for trouble from the way things are going, and you are constantly messing with stuff that can and will kill you if you aren't lucky. All I can do is just sit here all day after selling off some figurines and try to greet you all with a smile when you get back, knowing that every time you walk out those doors it might be the last time I ever see you. She said with tears in her eyes. Look, there's nothing wrong with worrying about us. Hell, if anything, it just means you are being a great goddess. You just need to accept that being a goddess also means you have to prepare yourself for the inevitable event that we get messed up. It's going to happen. There's no escaping it if our familia is to grow. At some point one of us is going to get really messed up or even killed. Rather than worrying about that inevitable fate, why not try and make the most of every moment you have with us so that we are never truly forgotten? I said seriously before leaving her to her thoughts. Heavy stuff, I know, and particularly hard to swallow for a cheerful goddess like her, but this conversation had been long overdue. Adventurers fight for a better future for themselves or even others, and that meant we risked death and sometimes lost that gamble. It was part of being an adventurer. It wasn't something that was really talked about, but every familia over a certain size has experienced the death of an adventurer or even multiple. The deity at the head of any familia has to be prepared to accept that loss and remember their fallen child even as they moved on, because the world doesn't stop for everyone else when someone dies. Perhaps it's because I'm becoming more like a cursed spirit as I grow stronger, but I've come to accept that death is just a part of being an adventurer. I'm not saying lives don't have value or anything, but it's not the end of the world when one of us dies, no matter who it is. Chapter 102, Final Preparations. Clearing my head of these thoughts, I moved to my workshop that I had connected to the church via a small hallway with yet another finger-eating door at the end. Unlocking the door, I entered the place and shut the door behind me. Walking over to my chests of stored materials, I opened the one that was empty and deposited the Goliath's hide in it, but kept the large skeleton with me since I had a plan for that. I sat down in the chair in the center of my workshop and took out the first of the Goliath's bones. In a funny way, I could be considered the first person to ever use a Goliath's bones as a drop item. It wasn't something that dropped normally, as that was instead the hide and teeth of the tough bugger. The bones themselves were more or less very similar to the teeth, though much more substantial, since obviously there was more bone than teeth in its body. Much like the teeth though, the bones were a sort of yellowish-white and slightly reflective. I felt like I was holding a dinosaur bone as I hefted one of the things into my lap. Placing my hands at either end of the large bone, I closed my eyes and activated my technique. It helped when I closed my eyes, as I was feeling the essence of the item my technique flowed through. This bone was a level 4 material and heavily resisted any change I sought to inflict upon it, so closing my eyes helped me focus exclusively on that material. I coaxed out the impurities and wild properties that I didn't want while refining it, and the property I did want: regeneration. In my previous level up, my vessel rapidly collapsed under the pressure of hitting the absolute limit. This time I plan to counter this collapse if possible, and if not, at least stall it long enough for me to know what my options for developmental skills are before Hestia finishes leveling me up. That was why I needed a stable version of the Goliath's regeneration as the only property left in its bones. I was going to fuse them into a box that will continuously heal whoever was in it so long as it was fed energy. While it wouldn't totally remove the risk of death from this second time smashing my head against the limit to have the most perfect leveling path ever and thus the highest chance at godhood, it would lower that risk greatly. My second set of preparations after completing this box would be to create a small barrier around the box so that when I level up, the cursed energy above the city doesn't go haywire. Actually leaving the city a good distance would be best, but that would probably be suspicious as hell. After the war game, people were paying attention to us now, even if only to see if we'll become a problem. Bell's recent level up had caused a bit of a commotion, but no one found it hard to believe since he had fought and defeated an adventurer both more experienced and higher level than him. The funny part though was that there were rumors that I was less talented than him since he had leveled up to 3 before me, even though I had been an adventurer longer. But only our Familia and Hermes knew how wrong that was. It wasn't that he was more talented so much as he settled for fantastic and safe but not dangerously high for his stats at level ups. I on the other hand gambled with death for my last level up, and I was going to do it again because the trade-off was well worth it in my opinion. This also meant it would take me longer and longer than him to level up, but that was by no means to say I was less talented. Anyways, leaving the city to level up was out of the question with so much attention on us. With that being the case, I wanted to at least make sure the cursed energy didn't cause a mess when I leveled up. Otherwise people are going to be able to start making the connection, and I'd rather not have to explain what that energy was or what it had to do with me. The longer people go on thinking I was using mana and magic, the better. Having something unique is all well and good when no one knows what makes it different, but jealousy is a bitch to deal with once those differences are known. The barrier I had planned to make would be one with only a single function: worldly separation. In simple terms, all it would accomplish would basically be to temporarily isolate my existence from the outside world, a sort of deprivation chamber if you will. From within the barrier I will not be able to see, hear, smell or sense any of the outside world, and the same will go for outside the barrier looking in. Obviously air would be able to come in since breathing is still a thing I have to do, but otherwise I may as well not exist when in the barrier. Probably rather overboard, but I'd prefer not risking it. First though, I had to make the life coffin, patent pending, and I worked tirelessly to refine and condense the Goliath's bones and their innate regeneration properties before fusing them into a literal rectangular box 3 feet wide, 2 tall, and 7 long. The whole thing was pearly white after I refined the bones and glowed slightly, but I wasn't done quite yet. I also added 4 energy slots that accepted stones, cursed energy, or mana straight from a person to fuel it. The finishing touch, however, with the technique required Cassandra's help, or rather the help of her healing magic. By itself right now the box had minor regenerative properties just because of the sheer quality of that aspect in the bones that I enhanced to make it. But I needed a sort of spark of power to finish the box and make it work as intended. Reverse curse technique would work if I knew how to use it, but pure healing magic would also work. She was in the dungeon with Daphne, Belle, Lily, and Welf at the moment though, so I went to work on the barrier pylons instead. Since the caster of the barrier i.e. me would be indisposed while the barrier was up, I need to anchor it to something else that would serve as the fuel source and foundation of the barrier. In this case I was going to create 6 pylons that will serve to give the barrier structure and fuel thanks to the cursed stones attached to them. I went into my nearby material chests to grab crystal mantis drops and mithril to form the pylons' main bodies before slitting my wrists with my weapon's razor edge and bathing the pylons in my blood. I healed the wound and cleaned up the mess, but this was to give the barrier just that little extra oomph. Chapter 103, Level 3. Once they were primed, I imbued my restrictions in them at the same time while chanting. Emerge from the darkness, blacker than darkness. Conceal that which is laid bare. Immediately a dark liquidy shadow substance appeared and fell from my hand and then got absorbed into the pylons while sweat poured down my forehead as I was straining to produce this curtain-type barrier. This was not unexpected since was my first attempt at creating a barrier, and while I knew the chant and how to roughly create a barrier, experience was golden here. Any cursed energy user could make a curtain-type barrier so long as they knew how, but depending on the way the thing functioned you had to change the chant slightly. For really powerful barriers you needed to also include binding vows to the barrier and a bunch of other stuff like keys and positioning. Barriers were a sort of complicated topic and I had no intention of learning more than the bare minimum needed to use domain expansion. Still 5 minutes later I felt the barrier fully snap into place in the pylons and released my hold on it, letting the pylons suck it all up. All that remains is to finish the box once Cassandra returns, and I'll be ready to update and level up after I hear my DS options. I thought with a sigh as I relaxed and chose to let my natural energy regeneration recharge my cursed energy. It took another hour for Cassandra to return and help finish the box by using her healing spell on it while I ignited the regeneration properties of the box and stuffed it permanently into a cursed technique that was dormant until someone with an injury got in the box. Do you really need so many preparations just to level up? Daphne asked, confused when I started setting this stuff up. Last time I leveled up I barely survived and sort of created a giant commotion that people are still trying to figure out, so yes. Besides, this box at least has uses outside just this since it is a healing item. I said honestly. In case we get a repeat of the last time, are there any developmental skills I should choose? Hestia asked worriedly. Mystery, enchant, hammer or axeman, and anything related to curses or space if any of that shows up. I said seriously. Not abnormal resistance? Daphne asked confused. The DS doesn't work on curses and I'm already a hard counter to poison, so I don't need it, might as well get a more useful skill instead. Anyways, no reason to delay this any more than necessary, wish me luck. I said before activating the barrier with me and Hestia inside it. I know there's no stopping you from doing this, but I'll do my best. Hestia said with a determined look. You have my full faith, and if it goes sideways know that you are not to blame, I'm a stubborn asshole after all. I said with a smirk as I laid down in the box on my stomach. Hestia pricked her finger and a single drop of blood fell on my fauna, and with a swish of her finger over my back heat rapidly began to fill me as I updated. Soon the heat grew to unbearable levels as I started to feel bloated again, but I noticed it wasn't nearly as bad as the first level up. Perhaps it was because of the last level up that my vessel was more capable of holding that much power this time, so it was taking longer to collapse. The box had also activated, so that was also keeping me awake during this process. There's enchant, one-hander, loner, curse body and abnormal resistance. Hestia anxiously said since I was still awake. Aw fuck. Loner gives more excelia and stats when I hunt alone, and enchant would give me an immediate boost to my cursed tool crafting but isn't strictly necessary to reach the top, it just helps. Curse body is new though, and if does what I think it might be the best option here, but might make me closer to pure curses. I thought, rather annoyed at all the really good options. I discarded one-hander immediately because it was just a weapon skill buff like hammer or axeman, and once again entirely unnecessary to reach the top, but helped. Curse body, I said through gritted teeth. Hestia moved her finger again and the fauna began to glow blindingly bright as the level up went through, but I passed out. I wasn't out for nearly as long as last time thanks to the box healing me, but I was still out for an entire day, and even after that felt like absolute dog shit. Name, Alexander Drake. Race, cursed human. Level 3. Strength 0, I. Endurance 0, I. Agility 0, I. Dexterity 0, I. Magic 200, G. Spells, Hell's Forge, innate technique, can use anything from a living being and reshape or refine it per one's will. Incantation, Hell's Forge, extensions, cursed tool creation. Hellfire, subsidiary technique flames created originally from an extension of the Hell's Forge curse technique but expanded into a cursed technique all their own that contain the tiniest spark of true hell flame, incantation, hell fire. Skills, heavenly restriction. In exchange for the ability to wield mana and magic, one gains access to cursed energy and cursed techniques. Blessing of Black, permanently increases cursed energy efficiency, amount, and control. Magic will always start at G rank after leveling up. Vessel of Sin, Hell's Forge Master carries the burden of all mortal sin and is tasked to purify it from the souls of the dead. Strengthen soul over time. Permanent increase to crafting with cursed energy. Permanent decrease to all stats for each innocent soul killed and increase for each sinful soul killed. Grants skill, Soul Gaze. Soul Gaze, see the souls of all things and their sins. Developmental skills, Curse Smith, H, Curse Body, I. Other than my stats, there was two major changes I got from this level up. The first was that my Hell Fire had actually become its own curse technique and as a result got a hell of an upgrade, pun very intended. Hestia also sorta very much freaked the fuck out about it since true Hell Flame was a divine fire and should be impossible to exist here, yet I had the tiniest spark of the stuff. When it said that, by the way, it meant it as the spark was like a pinprick of light in the otherwise black flames but very much present. The second was my developmental skill that was a gamble taking but so worth it once I figured out what it actually did near instantly. To put it simply, the DS made my cursed energy more efficient. It did this by improving the natural affinity for the stuff my body had, so in that regard I was sorta right about the downside as well. The DS made me more like a cursed spirit that was naturally very efficient with their cursed energy since they were literally made of the stuff. Chapter 104, Visitors. It took me 3 whole days after leveling up to return to some sense of normal and not feel like my body was holding a grudge against me. That wasn't to say my body was done with its refinement from the level up in that time, merely that I no longer felt like shit. It came as little surprise, but my tattoos had grown a bit, though admittedly not by much. I now had 3 long triangles on my back at each side just under my shoulder blades, which I assumed represented wings of a sort. If I ever actually turn into a cursed spirit, I think I'll actually look like a demon at the rate this is going. I thought with a chuckle. Level 3 already, lad? Really making the rest of us look bad with how fast you and that other lad are shooting through the levels. Hraldar said with a laugh. He, like most of the city, had gotten the news of my level up almost the same day it was reported to the guild and had come for a visit as a result. Not much sense in slowing down when we can rise quickly now, is there? I asked with a shrug. Aye, that's true. Still, you two got some people starting to wonder if you'll come to threaten those hegemons sitting at the top at the rate you're growing. He said seriously. Not likely. While I can't speak much for Loki and her familia, we are fairly friendly with both Freya and Hephaestus at the moment, so neither are likely to turn hostile to our rise. I said honestly. Now that you mention it, how come you aren't charmed by Freya like everyone else? Hell, she's even got a bloody level 7 charmed and yet you seem unaffected. He asked curiously. I shook my head with a chuckle. Otter isn't charmed by her, just devoted to such a degree that it might appear that way. As for myself, I am just the exception to the rules, so that infamous charm of hers rolls right off me rather than digging in. Ironically, that is actually one of the things that pleases her the most and why she is so friendly with me. She's lonely. I said honestly. Bollocks. She can get nearly any man or woman in the entire world into her bed if she wanted to. Hraldar said in disagreement. Indeed she could, but that was the whole damn issue. She can't have friends like normal folk because her charm affects damn near everyone. For all the company she could have, she is so alone that besides Otter she has no real companions. I present an opportunity for her to change that, so naturally she was eager to take it. That was how we got where we are now. I said calmly. Hadn't thought of it like that, but upon imagining it, it doesn't seem so far-fetched at all. How do you know all this anyways, lad? He asked and I smirked. She told me herself, of course. I said casually. Hraldar wasn't the only visitor I got after my level up got passed around, as Tiona, Te, Hermes and Hephaestus also came to give congratulations as well as look to uncover juicy information for themselves. Hermes cough. For Tiona, she wanted to test how much stronger I was now, but left disappointed that I wasn't in any shape for sparring. Te was under the impression that after my level up my crafting abilities had no doubt soared to new heights and wanted to commission a whole plethora of things from me at my new and improved level of ability. I had to quite bluntly explain that that wasn't how the fuck that worked at all. While in theory leveling up should make me a better craftsman, the reality of the matter was that all it did was increase the room I had to grow as a craftsman instead. I had already reached the pinnacle that I could achieve in the short term for my level 2 abilities before I leveled up, but now I had a new pinnacle to stride towards after leveling up. Cursed tool crafting was simply just like that, where there was in fact a limit to what you could achieve depending on your actual level of power. More power meant a higher limit, simple as that. Obviously you could exceed these limits with the right circumstances, but the idea still stood just fine. Even in terms of my non-cursed tool creations such as the figurines, all my leveling up had done was increase my available cursed energy pool while allowing me to use less energy to do more. That last part was entirely because the energy had gotten an upgrade in quality when I leveled up, and thus a smaller amount was worth more than before. Curse body was also needing to be taken into account here, as it boosted my efficiency by a not small amount. In any case, I had bluntly told that he needed to chill the fuck out with his rampant commissioning, as I still needed time for myself and didn't want to spend all of my time working like his commissions would have had me. I did accept a couple of smaller projects from him though, just to keep him happy. Hermes was less welcome when he visited, however, as I still maybe was holding a small grudge from the previous incident. I have to admit, you certainly have a pair on you to actually show up here looking for information, I said with a raised eyebrow at the smug blonde god sitting across from me. It wounds me that you'd think so little of me. Do I seem like such a treacherous individual? He asked, feigning sadness. I nodded vigorously. Yep, you give me the impression that you'd be more than happy watching terrible shit go down if it meant you achieved your goals, I said seriously. His face twitched a bit at that and I chuckled. Seems like I struck a nerve. Dead on, am I right? I asked, and he sighed. That skill of yours is rather annoying, no hiding one's intentions at all when your very soul is laid bare to see. Since this is the case, I'll be straightforward. You are dangerous and I'm here to make sure you don't become a problem, he said firmly with a sharp look in his eyes. I smiled. See, was that so hard? It's a wonder how much we'd get done if everyone was so clear from the get-go. Not that you are being entirely honest here, that is. You already know becoming evil isn't possible due to my skill. No, you are here to try and fish for information on my full strength, no doubt to try and make plans to tame me so I don't get in your way, I said with an amused look as his expression darkened. Chapter 105, Fiery Changes. Hermes of course ended up leaving in a bad mood after I flat out ripped off the mask he was wearing to cover his true nature and thoughts. I didn't care, however, as the god was little better than a snake that was waiting to sink its poisoned fangs into you. Perhaps his intentions were good in general, but he was far too willing to cross lines he shouldn't to achieve his end goals. The less such a person knew about my abilities, the better in my opinion. The best part though was that I knew for a fact Freya was breathing down the Masagar god's neck to keep him in check and from making plays involving my familia in the shadows. How did I know this? Because I had asked her to do so once it became clear Hermes wasn't going to leave it well enough alone. Despite technically being a mere delivery familia on the surface, the Hermes familia was easily one of the most influential familias in Orario and the wider world as well, with more than a little blackmail on many powerful people. I wasn't stupid enough to antagonize such an entity without having the backing needed to keep it from crushing me like a bug. Freya was more than happy to take that position, which even if it wasn't explicitly stated also made my familia something to keep a healthy relationship with for even the Hermes familia out of caution. Anyways, Hephaestus's visit was pleasant enough, even if a little awkward, as she tried and failed miserably at flirting. I mean, like E for effort, but clearly romance was not her strong suit. I admit I also probably frustrated her to no end, as despite having an army of people wanting to hook up with her, she had to choose one person who wasn't really interested. Like, I get why she was trying to hook up with me since it was sort of public knowledge, but basically she had decided that she would only hook up with a craftsman that managed to impress her. My cursed technique definitely qualified, and that was pretty much the whole reason she was trying to snag me for herself. It was a weird fucking way to decide a partner in my opinion, but who am I to judge? It also wasn't like I was totally averse to the idea either, as she was so my type. She was hot, easy to understand for me, and smart, the whole package. My reluctance, however, came in the form of her not wanting to play by catch and release rules, but rather for keeps. If she was going to get me, she wanted to make sure I knew that that was it. I was spoken for afterwards. I wasn't really interested in that level of commitment at this point, unfortunately. I might be okay with it later when my leveling slowed to a crawl due to the amount of power I had, making it difficult to find a challenge, but for now I wasn't going to give in to her attempts at attraction. Anyways, once my body finished its refinement, I started messing around with my flames that were now a whole ass cursed technique. After the upgrade from extension to full technique, the flames had changed in a few interesting ways. The first was of course the spark of true hell flame that winked out of existence almost the instant it appeared, but was devastating to whatever it touched in that time span. I'm talking now, you see it, now you don't type devastating. The second change was that the flames became more real, I suppose was a good description. Before there was no force behind my flames, just heat and death. Now however sending out a burst of flames actually caused some pressure to be pushed back onto me like a normal flame would. If I concentrated my flames to burn brighter but in a smaller area like a rocket thruster, I could even create enough reverse force to push myself back. This gave me the idea that if I used them right it might be possible for me to fly in a similar fashion to Iron Man. Naturally I attempted exactly that, and well, it didn't go so great. I could certainly get off the ground, but the issue is that humans aren't built in a fashion to fly like this. My arms and feet that were the sources I used to try and fly from twitched and moved, which in turn messed with the angles and direction of the thrust put on me. I spun out of control and dragged my face across the grass or into a wall more times than I like to count. Turns out that whole scene from the first Iron Man movie where Tony blasted himself into the ceiling and walls was not just for shits and giggles. I was durable as shit thanks to my stats, but that didn't mean face planting at like 20 miles an hour didn't hurt like a fucking bitch. Everyone else in the familia laughed their asses off at my failures over that whole 3-day period before I got the hang of it and actually hovered for the first time. They certainly weren't laughing then, but were jealous as shit instead. Anyways, once I had proof of concept for flame-propelled flight, I set that aside to continue messing with my flames to figure out what else had changed about them. I did eventually discover that the alive factor of the flames had further developed, as I could now create fire clones. These weren't real clones but rather merely my flames formed into a humanoid shape that could move and fight like me somewhat. They were still just flames though, and thus didn't actually have much substance to them, but if you didn't know that, they were very good distractions. Your magics are so unfair. Daphne complained after seeing my new clones. All magic is unfair, some are just more so than others. I said sagely. Said the man that spent 3 days eating dirt just to hover a foot off the ground. She said with rolled eyes. Not my best moment, I admit, but to be fair I can't be blamed. I mean, come on, don't tell me that you wouldn't try to fly if you thought you could. I said, and she reluctantly nodded. Chapter 106, Styles and Potential. Now that you've leveled up, I assume you'll be going deeper into the dungeon now, right? She asked, changing the subject. Nope. I said with a snicker at the incredulous expression she had at that answer. But why not? She asked, confused. I like to squeeze every drop of potential and benefit I can from each part of the dungeon I explore before I move on. I simply haven't done so yet for the Great Tree Labyrinth. I said honestly. But aren't those monsters now sorta weak for your current strength? She asked, missing the point. Besides the green dragon and variants that sometimes show up down there, that's true. However, the drops and materials from those floors are especially useful for me. I even discovered a whole new species of monster down there the last time I went, so who is to say that I might not discover even more wondrous things there before I'm done with the place? I said with a widened grin. You used that weird magic of yours to find those monsters, right? She asked curiously. Cursed technique, but yes, that was how I discovered the species. It wasn't even all that incredible a find, to be honest, as even normal grubs are well known to live inside trees, so finding out that monster grubs were also found there in the dungeon trees was kinda a matter of course. I said with a shrug. Whatever you say. Anyways, when are you going to make Cassandra and I some new stuff? She asked bluntly. Have some patience. I haven't forgotten or anything, but for Cassandra alone I'll still need more time, as I am not quite able to use that refined unicorn horn yet. As for you, there's not a whole hell of a lot I can do for you besides giving your current weapon an upgrade, since you rarely use your full power. I can't even really make any supportive items for you either, as you suck at staying in one fighting style. Seriously, like it's either you are on the front lines or are playing distraction with hit and run tactics. I said, annoyed. She got quiet at that, as I wasn't wrong at all. She had been rather indecisive about how she wanted to fight, and it made things annoying for me to try and make any useful items for her. For the rest of the familia's members it was easy as shit to find a way to improve on their fighting styles because they are consistent in how they did things. Not to say that Daphne wasn't skilled in fighting, because no one gets to level 2 without some degree of skill, but she was all over the place in how she fought. Sometimes she was right up there with Belle, Welf, and Lily at the front directly fighting the monsters, but then other times she was practically acting as a rogue that skirted the fight to take attacks of opportunity before slipping back to a safe distance. Even worse was that she had a whole ass magic that she simply refused to use unless it was absolutely necessary. The really annoying part for me was that it was a boosting type magic to boot, which meant she was never at full power without using it, which made my job as a craftsman so much harder than necessary. I'm not saying that being able to go from one style to another wasn't good, because it certainly was. But when it starts to get in the way of you improving, it's probably time to decide which was your primary style and which was your backup. I left her to think about that and went into my workshop to tinker with my new limits in the crafting department. Naturally, the potency of my Hell's Forge technique had gone up considerably after my level up, so the upper limit of material levels went up to level 5 and maybe even 6 once I got better at working on stronger, more potent stuff. This wasn't to say my skill went up, merely that my technique was more potent, better fuel for it now after all. First I tested my technique on level 1 materials like goblin teeth and war shadow claws. I was amazed to find that it practically cost next to nothing to mold the things even after refinement. A fascinating thing I discovered was that after I pushed a material's refinement to the limit, it transformed qualitatively. I affectionately refer to this transformation as material ascension. Goblin teeth that were ascended, for example, reached level 2 in quality while also gaining a sort of special property having to do with the weapon-wielding DSs that boosted them further than normal. So a normal monster material pushed to ascension gains special properties like a variant monster's drops, but more specific to that species as a whole rather than the single individual. Is this why variant drops have special properties? Do they themselves ascend to a higher existence and thus their drops do too? I pondered this phenomenon curiously. I experimented further and came to the nasty conclusion that at the moment I could only ascend level 1 materials. This wasn't because the materials were too strong either, but rather it was like my technique itself was resisting the attempt. In other words, a bottleneck had reared its ugly head yet again. Admittedly, I had been wondering when I'd find another one after I broke the previous one when I fought that minotaur so long ago. From what I understand, they weren't exactly uncommon in the world of Jujutsu Kaisen, as each user of a cursed technique pushed the limits of their techniques, and that meant finding areas that they stalled in until they got some form of enlightenment. The two most common bottlenecks were domain expansion and reverse curse technique. Both were notorious for the difficulty they presented to accomplish, with even someone considered a prodigy of that world like Satoru Gojo only figuring out reverse curse technique after coming close enough to death to feel its chilling breath on his face. Smaller bottlenecks like this one that I had just discovered, however, should be far more common and easier to get through so long as you kept banging your head against it till something broke. I wasn't going to be doing that just yet though, as I had so much more room in other directions that I could improve before I really needed to expand my technique to go further. Honestly speaking, my cursed technique was one of those bittersweet type deals in that for all its vast power it actually had too much potential. It wasn't nearly as straightforward as my newly minted Hellfire curse technique that was basically just a quirky fire. My Hell's Forge simply had too many different potential ways that I could expand and improve it because of the sheer vastness of the concept it embodied. Chapter 108, Direction. The Forge of Hell, an idea of such grand size and significance that mastering every facet of it would take multiple lifetimes easily. So far I had worked on the fire, sin, or soul, kinda blurry there, crafting and transformative facets of the concept, and even then I was by no means having mastered them. Off the top of my head I could think of 3 more facets that I hadn't even begun to mess with: punishment, hell itself, and demons. Not exactly the most socially acceptable of things to try and dip your toes in, as you can tell. It also helped that I had no fucking clue how to even dip my toes into those facets. Like, you might think I could try and make a cursed spirit for demons, but I tried that shit and let me tell you it felt wrong. Like striking someone with lightning to bring them back to life, doable but not a part of lightning itself as a concept. In the same vein, while I could make a cursed spirit, it wasn't part of my technique conceptually speaking. As for the other 2 facets of my technique, I didn't even have a clue. Well, beyond perhaps dressing up as a bat and beating sinful people within an inch of death for punishment, I wasn't going to do that, by the way. I also could exactly ask any of the gods about hell either, as even Hestia was extremely tight-lipped about such topics. Some sort of divine law or other such shit, she had said. That was a divine topic and not something a mortal should have any business knowing. It was kinda the same reason why no divine object is supposed to be able to show up down here in the mortal realm. The sheer fact my flames had even that tiniest spark of true hellfire was cause for extreme alarm as far as Hestia, Myake, and Hephaestus were concerned. Speaking of, the Forge Goddess had practically begged me for some of the sparks of true hellfire. According to her, with her Arca Enum sealed and there being no divine materials here, she couldn't make the best stuff possible for her, like if she were in heaven. My true hellfire, however, provided a minuscule loophole that she was uncomfortably eager to leap through. It was curiosity more than anything for her, apparently. She really wanted to know what would happen if she somehow managed to create a divine artifact while in the mortal realm. I was not exactly all that interested in helping her with that project after Hestia mentioned offhandedly that the Forge Goddess had once evaporated an entire planet's worth of water just to quench a divine blade. In case it wasn't obvious, I fucking live on this planet and would really prefer its water not being totally evaporated. That did give me a bit of a internal debate though, as I was a little curious if that water amount also applied to the dungeon or not. Not saying that the busty redhead would go that far, but in my personal experience we craftsmen aren't that great at holding back when an idea involving crafting takes us. Needless to say, despite her very arousing, the mind is strong but the flesh is weak, attempts at persuading me to hand over some of those sparks I refused. She still won in the end regardless of my refusal, because she managed to have my soldier stand at attention, which was good progress as far as she was concerned. Anyways, back to me messing with my technique. Besides learning about material ascension on accident, I also discovered a fascinating thing about my technique after I reached level 3, abnormal senses. I don't mean like the physical senses, but rather an unexplainable ability to gauge the quality of stuff at a glance. I could do something similar before now, but only when I was physically touching the object, and even then only when it was made from something that had a living source. Getting an upgrade from wired to wireless, in a manner of speaking, was awesome but unexpected. I also had been trying to create a domain since I recovered after my level up by trying to visualize how exactly that would work. Logically, one would assume that my first technique's domain would be similar to Mahito's embodiment of self-perfection from Jujutsu Kaisen due to the similar effects of our techniques at first glance. His technique worked to manipulate his own soul and the souls of others, which in turn allowed him to effectively transform anyone he used it on as their bodies shifted to match their souls. It was in a way eerily similar to what my technique seemed to do, but the differences were staggering. His technique, and by extension domain, only affected souls, and only if he was touching the target. Those were basically the only restrictions it had. He could turn animate to inanimate or back as easy as breathing. He could seemingly make a normal person grow way bigger or smaller without messing with their density, or even while doing so as a huge fuck you to the laws of conservation. My technique, while more expansive, was also more limited, as I needed to touch the target. It had to be from a living source. I couldn't make more of it or turn it into something entirely different. I also couldn't fuck with souls directly, since yes, as a matter of fact, I did make an attempt at it. Souls weren't physical things though, so my technique went digging for something physically that had no existence in a physical sense. Ironically, this exact thing was also what tipped me off that while physical injuries of most sorts weren't beyond my ability to mend, I was particularly vulnerable to spiritual wounds. Obviously my soul was stronger than a normal person's, but I couldn't fix it like I could my body if it somehow got injured. Anyways, as I was saying before I got off track, my domain would end up very different than Mahito's. My problem was that I didn't consider my technique to be meant for combat. I could use it in that regard, of course, but it wasn't great at it unless I was against a drastically weaker opponent. Thing was, however, that I hadn't seen hide nor hair of any non-combat oriented domains from the source material of Jujutsu Kaisen. This was as a result uncharted territory for me, and something I need to ponder seriously. Obviously my domain would boost my innate technique drastically, but how exactly that would look and how it was done was the parts that were eluding my search. I had a vague gut feeling that my domain would be infernal looking, likely a depiction of how my mind saw the forge in hell. It was the details, however, that were missing, the tools, the sure hit technique, and all the built-in buffs to my technique. Chapter 109, A Licorn Glove. As I had expected, it wasn't so simple to create a domain. Merely thinking about it wasn't enough, you needed something more. Whether it was a spark of inspiration or perhaps even some sort of external pressure, I suppose I'd only figure it out at a later date. I didn't try and force the issue either, as I knew that it wouldn't work, and instead turned my attention to a different direction. Grabbing the refined unicorn horn, I began experimenting with my cursed technique to try and extend its effect to level 5 or 6 materials. While Ogun and Hephaestus both agreed that the weapon I made for the dark-skinned god was first class, I considered that not to be the case. I was a perfectionist, honestly, so knowing that true first-grade weapons were made of much better materials usually made me unwilling to accept my own creation being classified the same. My crafts were as good as they were because I directly purified and refined the materials I used to levels that were thought impossible or next to for others. Hell, I was the first person to figure out that materials could be ascended to a higher state if refined enough. Now that sounds pretty mundane, but I fucking guarantee that if I were to make this discovery public, the whole world would collectively lose their shit. Even worse was that when people finally realized that I alone was the only person able to pull it off, it would become open season on my ass in every sense imaginable. My whole warning during the war game would cease to be all that effective, as the possible gains outweighed the losses dramatically. That doesn't even begin to cover the sheer amount of threat to my life by those who don't wish to see what would come about by me growing into my potential. I could maybe survive a fight against a level 4 that was decently far along that stage, but if even a single level 5 or gods forbid higher were to show up, my chances of survival plummet drastically. I shook my head to chase these thoughts from my head and focused on the block of glowing unicorn horn. Normally I just sort of overwhelmed the material with my energy to get my technique to work, but clearly that didn't work for materials after level 4. This time I decided to take a different approach and refine my own energy into a sort of cursed energy thread, like surgical needles for precise work. This was a new way to use my energy, so it took me a couple of days to get a rough grasp on it and finally get a reaction from the block. The precise use of my energy meant that I wasn't just brute forcing the material to do as wished while it heavily resisted. Instead it was as though I was only facing a much smaller portion of its resistance that, while I couldn't outright ignore, also didn't prove all that challenging to work around. I suppose the best way to describe it was that my cursed energy was sort of a Trojan horse that once inside quickly eliminated any resistance it faced without so much as touching the robust defensive wall of the material. Don't get me wrong, this was not fucking easy at all. It took serious concentration and time to maintain, but it was totally worth it when I finally managed to transform the block of glowing horn into an ornate pearly white mesh glove with a plated backside and detailed depiction of a licorn, winged unicorn, on the back of the palm. Once I was done, I left my workshop to find Cassandra, who should still be in the area since today was a rest day for Belle and the others. I found her unsurprisingly tending to the flowers in her casual clothes. "The flowers are growing well, good job," I said with a smile as I walked up. "Thank you," she said, embarrassed about the unexpected praise. "I'll let you get back to it in a bit, but I was wondering if I might get your help in finishing this piece here," I said, presenting the glove. "How pretty." "I don't mind helping," she said, clearly liking the item's appearance. "Great. So all I need you to do is put this on and then cast both of your spells, nice and easy, right?" I said with a grin. "But..." She looked at her dirty hands reluctantly. "You need not worry about getting it dirty since it's made of unicorn horn and will repel any dirt off it," I said reassuringly. She reluctantly slipped the glove on and shuddered a little when I grabbed her now gloved hand and went to work changing the glove size and shape to fit her perfectly. When I gave her a nod, she started chanting her first spell, and as the energy traveled through her hand for it, I used it to start forming a set of restrictions and a cursed technique. I could have ended it there, but then the item would be incomplete in my opinion, so I waited until she had started casting her second spell to add more restrictions and change the technique into a bigger, more comprehensive one. Finally, however, I completed the item and it burst into a bright pearlescent glow while humming for a moment, which startled the girl but merely made me grin maniacally. "It's even better than I had hoped. A solid 50% boost to any spell you cast, and even has an additional utility ability as well. This lovely thing will also let you store your excess mana to be used for a one-time 300% boost to a single healing spell before you need to recharge it," I said, thrilled to pieces with how it turned out. "That sounds useful," she said offhandedly as she admired the gently glowing glove on her hand. "I'm glad you think so, since it was made for you after all," I said with a chuckle when she stiffened in shock. "What? No. I can't." She panicked and tried to deny the item. I held up my hand to stop her, though. "Easy there, this was always the plan, so you aren't imposing or anything. Besides, you are the only true healer in the familia, so if you don't take it, it would just sit uselessly on a shelf somewhere. Also, I sorta kinda made it so only you could use it anyways, so you are stuck with it. Sorry not sorry," I said with a grin. Chapter 110, Pros and Cons. Cassandra was such a treat to work with because she was so timid and worried about how others saw her that her reactions to even a little teasing were worth their weight in gold. That said, I wasn't here to torture the girl and left shortly after this. While the glove was a very useful item for her, it was not really a purely selfless thing that I made. I'm a perfectionist to a degree, and with the Fauna making changes to one's abilities based on their desires or experiences, I wanted to see if I could engineer a superior healer. Cassandra was timid but also so invested in what those around her thought of her that if I could plant the idea that with the glove she was the best healing mage in the city, she might actually become the best in the city. For anyone else this plan would likely fail because that sort of mindset tended to come from within, but Cassandra was an exception. Even if this little experiment of mine failed, it wasn't like I had actually done anything bad to her, as I had merely given her an item that elevated her healing abilities is all. Honestly speaking, I didn't see a single downside to this entire thing, an absolute win no matter how this ends up. Moving on from that, I went back to working on improving my crafting ability with this new method of use for my cursed technique. It had its own pros and cons compared to my previous way of doing it that I thought worth going over. For the cons, well, it was slow for a start. Compared to the original method I used, it took far longer to achieve the same level of results. The second con was that it took far more focus as well, to the point I kinda lost track of my surroundings a bit, which left me seriously vulnerable. While I may not think anyone without permission could break into my workshop without either losing a finger or literally breaking their way in, that didn't mean I was right. The fauna has always given miraculous abilities to those who had it, so it was not impossible that there were people with skills to bypass physical obstacles so long as they weren't too thick. Hell, I had seen records of actual honest-to-God's teleportation and space manipulation skills or magics in the records of the public library. In the face of such things, my workshop's defenses may as well be tissue paper. As much as it pained me to admit, I also couldn't really go nuts with my workshop's defensive means either, as too many cursed items gathered together that shared malicious purpose was a recipe for a cursed spirit to be born in that concentrated gloom. I also knew that when crafting cursed tools, it's best to keep any outside influences at a minimum lest the final product be corrupted. This meant my workshop would ideally have a neutral affinity even when it was filled with cursed energy, which it was rapidly becoming. Cursed energy was kinda like air or water in that it moved from places of high density to places of low density once it started to flow. Until I showed up, the cursed energy above the city, and no doubt in other places in the world as well, had been still, stagnant. However, I had created a small, nearly imperceptible flow of cursed energy when I created an entire building using cursed energy. To put it bluntly, the cursed energy of high density above the city was trying to fill the low density area I had created, my workshop. Don't get me wrong, this was by no means a bad thing for me, quite the opposite in fact. More neutral affinity cursed energy density meant that I refilled my personal reserves many folds faster than if I were in an area without it. This also meant I could draw on this energy to use when crafting cursed tools to create stuff for much less personal cost energy-wise. Anyways, the point was that being left vulnerable when using this new method was not great news for me. The third and final con was that I basically went from easy mode to normal mode when using it, as there was no more of that. My technique did most of the work stuff. When using this new method, I had to manually form, stabilize, implement and fuse every restriction and technique I made for the cursed items. This ironically led me to the first pro of this method: every creation made with it was on a whole different level than the normal ones. As it turned out, manually having to do each detail myself meant that I didn't make anything half-assed like the intention method that the original method did. Don't get me wrong, the original method worked perfectly fine, but since I was delegating the details to my technique, it tended to choose the first setup that achieved my goal rather than the best one. If I got lucky, it used the best because that was the first option it found, but that was mostly relying on luck at that point rather than skill. Manually crafting every facet of a cursed tool, on the other hand, meant my personal best was always what I went with. The second pro was that this new method did wonders for my energy control, as I had to be incredibly precise in how and what I did while using it. This meant that even after I stopped using this method, any application of cursed energy afterwards was subconsciously much more efficiently done, a discounted black flash if you would. It was funny really that I learned so much about how to better utilize my cursed energy because of myself subconsciously trying to maintain the precision and efficiency that I had while using this method, but for any and all cursed energy usages. This in turn led to the third and final pro of this method: pseudo-formlessness. Thanks to this method subconsciously teaching me a better way to use my energy efficiently, I could shift my own body near flawlessly at will, though to an obviously lesser degree than Mahito did in the manga. It was honestly as though my own body became Play-Doh that I could shape however I pleased by moving and changing different parts of it. That said, it was really fucking weird to do on any large scale. Changing my skin color or something mostly superficial like that didn't bother me, but I got the chills when I did stuff like move my organs or shapeshift into a different person's appearance. That last one was particularly disturbing, as I can't even begin to describe how it felt.
Thanks for listening.